Welcome to A Woman's Heart. We have Dawn Sanders with us today. And thanks so much for joining us today, Dawn.
Thank you for having me, Lisa. I'm really excited to be here.
You are most welcome. I am looking forward to this conversation. I thoroughly enjoy getting to meet you in person and hearing a little bit about your story, which we will be getting into. But before we do that, I would love to get to know you a little better and have the audience get to know you a little better. So tell us about yourself and something fun that isn't normally in your bio.
Well, something fun, I think, is that I come from an enormous family.
Okay.
And when I say enormous, my father was one of eight, and he thought he came from a big family until he found out my mother was one of 32.
Oh my.
Yeah, my
Okay, yes, that was
grandfather,
a much larger number than I was expecting.
yes, my grandfather had two wives. His first wife had 15 children, and then my grandmother had 17 children, and then there was
Oh
only one set of twins.
my oh my word.
So
Oh.
my grandmother used to say she spent all of her married life with one in her belly, one at her breast, and one at her knee.
Oh my goodness. Yes, I can wow, I'm speechless. That is a lot of children, and I can imagine that that is pretty much how she did spend her married life. So my
Yeah,
hats off to her. Hats
I
off to
know, right? I have a friend who says, God bless the womb
her.
that bore 15 and 17 children.
Oh my goodness gracious. Wow, that is definitely a large number, and yeah,
Mhm.
when you said 8, I was like, "That's a big family,"
Yeah.
and then I expected something more along the lines of maybe 12, but not times 3. I did not
Yeah.
expect the multiplication.
Yeah, and it made for really fun gatherings, right? We have a family reunion every 2 years, and back when all of them were alive, it was just it was so much fun to you know re-engage and reconnect with all of that family.
Yeah, what a blessing, and that would be quite the family reunion going
Yep,
on. So
yep.
that is definitely something fun about you, and could you tell us a little bit more about you, and your background?
Okay. Well, I'm a Bible teacher,
Okay.
soon to be published author, and associate minister at the First Baptist Church of Glenarden International in Glenarden, Maryland. And there I am the director of the Sermon Based Life Group, so our small group ministry.
Okay, very good. Well, as you mentioned, you are a soon to be published author, and you I know this has been a labor of love and also a lot of pain. It's come out of some very difficult circumstances, but I like that it's not just a typical get through a hard time book. You came about this a little differently. So tell us how this worked, how this came about.
Wow. Well, the hard part is that I experienced two miscarriages and the death of my husband within the span of 8 months.
Mm,
And so that was the catastrophic, life altering event um, that led me to seek God. And as part of my seeking God, um, He led me to Genesis 1, the creation story, and showed me as I was attempting to rebuild my life that
mhm.
there in Genesis 1, He created the first lives. And often we think about that in relation to Genesis 2, the Adam and Eve story. But God
Yeah.
showed me how in Genesis 1, He gives us, well, I found a 7-step process on how to create a life.
Okay. Yeah, and that is not when I first heard about your book and your story, Genesis 1 is not the first thing that I thought of. I mean, you think of, or at least I would, think of different passages in the New Testament about, or possibly in the Old Testament, look, I behold a new thing and all of that. But I wouldn't have thought of Genesis. And were you just reading Genesis and it came to you, or were you just praying? And how did he bring Genesis 1 to your mind in the middle of, I mean, other than the fact that you were in the middle of chaos?
Yeah, it was, and I was in the middle of the chaos in so many ways because
Mhm.
it was the spring of 2020, the height of COVID.
Oh, yes,
Yeah,
we
early in the
yeah.
summer. And he told me during this time when, we all had all this extra time on our hands, to do a deep dive into the creation story. And immediately, right, the first two verses of the creation story say, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and there was darkness over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the space of over the face of the waters. And I read that description of the earth without form,
Mm,
void, and dark. And it felt very much like my life,
yeah,
my spiritual life, my personal life, and our physical experience with COVID. And
yeah,
so I was like, wow, I feel this so resoundingly in my spirit, but also in these other areas of my life. So I immediately felt the universal application that this was not just for someone who had lost their husband or who had experienced the death of a loved one, that this was
yeah.
really something that impacts a lot of people, anyone who's been through a dark, traumatic situation in their lives.
Yeah, I would imagine that could speak to anyone who's just going through a season or a period where they feel like everything's just crazy. They don't really know what's going on. They're lost, they're confused, they have no clarity, and it could be a traumatic event in their life. It could be the loss of a loved one. It could be any number of things, because even when I haven't experienced that, there are moments, maybe not a long season, but moments where even I'm kind of going, gosh, I feel like everything's swirling. I don't know what to do with this, Lord. This doesn't feel good. I don't know which end is up. I don't know which steps to take. I don't know where to go. And you feel very I mean, I would say frazzled, but you mentioned that void and that chaos and the darkness where it's just very confusing, very unsettling, I imagine, and it's hard to know what's the next step to take.
Exactly. And then as I'm looking at this passage and I'm seeing this in the beginning, and it
Mhm.
says that in the first three words, in the beginning,
In the
here I
beginning.
am feeling as though it's the end,
Yeah.
right, of a
Yeah.
lot of things in my life. And during COVID, that's how we felt, that a lot of things had ended, had come to a standstill.
Mhm.
But yet the first three words were in the beginning.
Yeah.
And and then at the end of that chapter and the beginning of chapter two, God has created the first two lives, male and female. He has put them in a place of power and position, and they entered God's rest. And I was in this crazy, frazzled, confused, helpless state going, but in the end of the story,
Mhm.
there's power, position, and rest. That was very attractive. And
Yes.
so I was so excited. God had told me to do this deep dive, but I was like, I can't wait to get to the end because,
Mhm.
we already know the end of the story and it's so good.
Yeah. Yeah, and I imagine as you're talking, I'm thinking, okay, so in the beginning, it's all this crazy, and then he he separates the heavens from the earth, and it's step by step. He doesn't just speak everything into existence at the same time. It even God walked through a process of creating one thing and then the next, and regardless, and even no matter where you are in evolution versus creation, even science will back that was the order that things came about. I mean, you have the
Exactly.
marine and the water, and then you have the the plants and then the animals. And the most recent, the last thing he did was humans. And we are the most recent to creation. And I love how it was just step by step, and I'm reminded even God took step by step. He took it one step at a time. So you mentioned there were 7 steps that you walked through people through. Is that based on per day, or is it based on just steps that you noticed throughout the process?
It was more steps that I noticed than clearly
Okay.
delineated days.
Okay.
So, the first step is remain connected. And in fact, the first step happens before the first day,
Mm.
right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And that too comes from verse 2, where it said the Spirit of God hovered. And it
Wow.
occurred to me the first thing God did in the creation story was not create light. That's the first thing he created, but it's not
Mm.
the first thing he did. The first thing he did was hover. So when we're in this chaotic, empty, dark, confused situation, if we find ourselves in a stagnant place, if we find ourselves kind of just hanging out, it's by design because God is hovering. And what I noticed too as I meditated on hovering is that it's the word in the Hebrew means kind of a circular movement, right? So God was moving in this moment, in this darkness and emptiness that feels very chaotic, like we can't take a step forward, right? But in the midst of all of that, God is moving.
Yeah.
And he's moving in a circular motion. So he's not moving forward to the next thing, but he's
Okay.
moving in that situation that we're in, and he's hovering above. So we don't have to fall into that deep, dark abyss that's in front of us, right? God's got us as long as we remain connected to him
Mhm.
and hover with him, we'll be okay. So the first thing to do is to, well, recognize that it's the beginning, like I said, the beginning and not the end. And because
Yeah.
it's the beginning, make sure you're connected to God, because sometimes during these traumatic situations, we can start
Mhm.
questioning, and not that questioning completely separates us,
No.
right, from
No,
God.
it doesn't.
Um, yep. So, but the thing about it is, it could separate us from God.
Mhm.
And so, if you have become in any way disconnected to God, or just feel disconnected, because just because we might feel disconnected from God doesn't mean he's disconnected from us.
Mhm.
And make the conscious decision to hang out with God until he decides to step forward. And that happens with the light. So that's step 2. And step 2, I word it seize the moment. And I word it seize the moment
Okay.
because in creating the light, God created time. Bible says that there was the evening, the darkness, and
Mhm.
then the morning, the light, the first day. Evening, morning, light, no, evening, morning, day, all speak to time. So in
Yeah.
creating this physical phenomenon of time, I mean of light, God also created the process and function of time. And so I say, seize the moment, that God will, along with giving us light, give us time. That's the first gift he gives us in life is
Yeah.
time,
Yeah.
time to live our lives. And so that's why I say seize the moment in the sense of live. For me, I had lived too much in darkness and death, and I needed to step into the light. I needed to seize that moment of stepping in. Part of that is a time to heal, and
Mhm.
then part of that is a time to move forward, and that God will show us when it's time to move forward.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note too, you mentioned that the whole arguing or doubting or questioning, that it can lead us away from God. It can also lead us much closer to him is that curiosity of, what about this and what about this and I don't get this. It can lead to a much closer relationship. And I know for myself, and some people may have heard it, is there have been times where I'm like, I don't like this and I don't get it and I don't even know if I want to, believe in you. Are you there and do I care if you're there? And but through that wrestling, some others have encouraged me that it's okay. It's not like he doesn't know you're doing it anyway. At least you're talking to him and he can handle it.
Exactly.
So those
Exactly.
questions can lead us to a much deeper understanding and a deeper relationship with Christ. So I don't think it's bad that we have questions at all. I think it can really lead to some beautiful things.
I agree with you wholeheartedly and say as much in the book that
Mhm.
questions, in fact, can lead us into a deeper relationship. That dialogue with Him is a good thing,
Yeah.
right? Prayer is a good thing in all its forms.
Yes. Yes, it is. So, and now what are some other things that you have these 7 steps. Is there a general theme, or some specific things that you really want the readers to take away from this?
It's funny you should say that because, yeah, I noticed as I was going through the process that one of the reoccurring themes is breath and breathing,
Mm,
right? I noticed it first in the word spirit. In Hebrew, the word we translate as spirit is breath or wind,
okay.
and it represents God's power being present in that moment. As I went through the whole process, it just kept reexerting itself in different ways. For instance, just in my meditation, it's like I told you, it's like the first thing God gives us is time. As a part of that, you know, um, it's part of why parents wait with bated breath for
Uh-huh.
their children's first breath, for that first cry,
Mhm.
because that's a sign of life,
Yeah.
right? It's one of the 4 signs of life is breathing.
Mhm.
So I had this theme that kept reoccurring um, in the third step, which you talked about a little bit when you were talking about the separating of the waters above and the waters below, which created the atmosphere and the seas,
Yeah.
right? Um, Creating that third step for me was create space to breathe and a source of water. So when God created that air, He created space to breathe. I talk about that all in one chapter because air is just another form of water. That's why God separated the waters, right? When
Mhm.
He created the air. And often water is a symbol of emotions. And so create space to breathe, create space for your emotions. Along with seizing the moment and shining the light, God will give us new vision for our life. And often in giving us that new vision, for every action, science says there's an equal and opposite
Yep.
reaction.
Mhm.
We'll have a reaction in our emotions. And I don't know about you, Lisa, but I haven't always been overjoyed with everything God has shared with me about my life. And so when God gave me the new vision of my life, one without my husband in it, one without natural born children in
Mhm.
it, I wasn't exactly thrilled. I was feeling the way I describe it in the book is some kind of way, and it wasn't good.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I've told people, I said, there are times when I paint a really pretty picture, and I just don't understand why God doesn't wanna go along with the picture that I've painted because it's really pretty.
It is. It's really pretty. And so I had to then deal with how I felt about that. And so that's what I mean by create space
Mhm.
to breathe, because I couldn't breathe in that chaotic, empty, dark situation. I
Yeah.
wasn't breathing in the sense of living,
Mhm.
fully living. And
Yeah.
so I needed to deal with my emotions because it was hindering me from moving forward in all that God had for me.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so we need to do that.
Yeah, those emotions can be really powerful, and they are a gift. I think we can listen to them, and they can definitely guide us. They can indicate things that are good, indicate things that aren't so good. I think it's Lisa Turkhurst said they're indicators, not dictators,
Amen.
as far as our feelings and our emotions, and I just say that my emotions are my superpower and my kryptonite.
Exactly.
They're both.
So So when we're creating space to breathe, we talked about that's the separating. So I basically
Mhm,
talk about separating out those emotions that aren't serving us during
yeah,
this season. And
mhm.
then the second thing God did was gather the remaining waters. And I want to point out, have you ever tried to separate water without like, a container or a tool of some kind, or
No,
gather water? It's not, I mean,
I
again, as I was
I can feel
meditating
some in
on
my
the
hand.
scripture, as I'm meditating on the scripture, I'm like, but he's all powerful. He was able to separate the waters and gather the waters. And I mention this too because for the children of Israel who Moses was writing to when he penned
Mhm.
Genesis, who had witnessed God gather the waters when he separated the Red Sea, I just have to imagine that that was a calming thing for them, right? That God created space for them to breathe as they walked across the
Yeah,
Red Sea on dry land. He created a safe space for them. And
mhm.
so I think that after God gives us this vision, right, we need a safe space to travel across those emotional waters.
Yeah,
And God is telling us to separate those emotions so that we can do that. But, and also to gather the other ones, but in gathering the other ones, he created a source of water, right? Because along with having air to breathe, we also need water in order to continue to live. And
yeah,
what I say there is, yeah, we separated out all the emotions that weren't serving us, but now we want to gather up all the ones that are, because as we go across this terrain that we're about to go across, we're going to need some of those, emotions that serve us to help us get to the other side.
yeah, yeah, you're right. There's so much to that, and I love the picture that you're painting and the visual of trying to gather water. I mean, and I just think of, like, in the pool or a sink, and I'll scoop it up with my hands, and I can hold some of it in my hands, but then others of it dribbles around, and, yeah, there's not but so much controlling water
And
without
isn't that,
serious containers.
and isn't that how we feel when we're dealing with our emotions?
Yeah, yeah. It can feel very overwhelming and like there's no control, and, no matter how many times you tell yourself or someone else tells you, "No, you can, it's up to you. You can control it. You can make a choice." It doesn't always feel like that in the
Mhm,
moment,
mhm.
and brain chemistry will also, tell you, "Nah," there's sometimes where you kinda have to wait for a certain moment before you really can insert some more control and thought and choice into it because your brain can kinda take over in certain areas. But,
Right.
I love the picture of that going through, and as in Genesis, he takes the chaos and he gradually forms things and separates and starts putting order to it. And as he started putting this, process of a little more order and a little more order into his life, what were some of those other things that you felt like he was really teaching you and maybe people, along the way on this process?
Yeah. Next along was sow productive seeds in fertile soil.
Mm,
That corresponds to the passage where God called the earth to bring forth uh, herbs and fruit trees,
mhm.
right? The vegetation on
Yeah,
the planet. And he described two types of vegetation: herbs and fruit bearing trees, herb plants and fruit bearing trees. And so I looked at those. Fruit are the only plants that produce a harvest, right? The other plants produce more vegetation, but
mhm.
fruit trees are the only vegetation that produces fruit, right? And so if you want to bear fruit in your life, you have to plant fruit seeds.
Mhm.
And the Bible says that fruit seeds are seeds where well, fruit is, what do I want to say? The vegetation, where the seed is on the inside, right?
Yes.
The other ones are where the seed is on the outside. And
Yes.
so for me, those are the activities that we do that build our lives. And we can build using unproductive, busy activities that lead
Oh, yeah.
nowhere. I mean, I think we all, it's any of us that have lived any amount of time know what it's like to feel like a gerbil on a wheel, running, 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 going
Yeah.
nowhere,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, or rocking in a rocking chair, you're moving,
Exactly.
really not going anywhere.
Not going anywhere, but exerting all this energy,
Yeah.
right? And
Mhm.
so we're so tired with nothing to show for it. And I didn't want a life like that. And
Yeah.
so as I was looking at the scriptures, I said, no, I want to plant fruit. I want to
Yeah.
plant fruit seeds so that
Mhm.
I can bear fruit.
Yeah.
And I call that productive seeds. So that's why I say sow productive seeds in
Mhm.
fertile soil. And fertile soil being the environment in which you're sowing.
Yeah.
Now, there can be a lot of environments, but for Christians, the place that Christ created where we're supposed to grow,
Mhm.
right, is the church. And so I recommend that we sow productive seeds in fertile soil, seeds that will help us bear fruit for the vision that God has given us for our lives in the place that He has created for us to grow. And when I thought about the place for us to grow, that's to prepare, right? At
Yeah.
some point in time, right, which is very actually the very next step, He's going to call us to move into that vision. But beforehand, He's going to place us in a season of preparation. And so we can get the skills, develop the connections, um, exercise our gifts so that we can be prepared for that next step, which is shine your light at the right time,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And well, and that just moves perfectly into one of the questions that I always love to ask. You've talking about getting together and really cultivating the soil and planting seeds. What would you say to encourage someone else to pursue the passion that God has placed in their heart?
Well, I agree with you that this is the right moment to talk about that, and that is to get prepared.
Mhm.
You know, when my husband came into my life, I was dating a different guy,
Oh.
and it was an unproductive relationship. We had actually, it was one of those on again, off again relationships that I was having trouble getting myself out of.
Okay.
Um, because this guy kept distracting me from what God had for me, my marriage with my husband,
Mhm.
right? And when I finally got with my husband, I looked back and I was like, people, we don't want to be distracted,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Especially when I think about the fact that I only had 4 years with my husband, 2 years before we got married, and then 2 years after. I
Wow.
could have been with my husband sooner. Now, I understand this was God's plan, and
Yeah.
so that's fine. I'm
Yeah.
just saying that we want to be ready. And so if whatever we can do to get ready so that when our blessing comes, we can take advantage, seize that moment when
Yes.
our blessing
The moment.
comes, I'm all for doing. And so I encourage people um, to get ready because God, if you're here, if He woke you up this morning, He has something else for you,
Mhm.
right? And so I encourage you to get ready for that next big thing because God's not done blessing you and something big is coming. Get ready.
Yeah. Well, Dawn, I love that you have been able to come through a horrible, horrible, very sad, traumatic event, and yet your smile and your joy and your zest for living and encouraging others just shines through, and I so appreciate that. And if someone wants more of that, they want to get your book and read everything about it, not just what we've been able to share today, and be encouraged by you, what's the best way for them to connect with you?
My website, dawnmansanders.com.
Okay.
Mhm. And when they do, I have a quiz now, and it's called "What's Your Starting Over Type?" Where if they complete the quiz, I'll provide them with results around the type of person they are as far as starting over.
Okay.
And along with those characteristics that I will provide will come 3 action steps that they can take immediately to begin moving forward in all that God has for them.
Wonderful. Well, that sounds very, very helpful. So we will make sure to include that in the show notes. And Dawn, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you for diving into Genesis so you could share all of these tips and principles with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Lisa. I really enjoyed the conversation.